Welcome to the next installment of the series, Important Questions in K-12 STEM Education. My name is Todd Hutner. There's a picture of me my first year teaching. I decided not to wear a tie today. And you can see in the intervening years, there are a few more wrinkles. I've taught in Tallahassee, Florida, and Austin, Texas, and now I'm at Argument Driven Inquiry. And if you're interested, you can find me on LinkedIn at Todd Hutner. Our moderator today is Jill Gregory. Today's question is, why do we care if the objective is on the board? So here's a picture. On the left is just a basic whiteboard, and on the right is a bit more engaging and friendly or inviting whiteboard configuration, but these are things you're going to see if you walk into classrooms across the country or maybe even the world. And so the question is, why do we care if the objective is on the board? Or potentially more broadly, why do we care about the whiteboard configuration? Why has this been so important? And maybe I'm giving it away at the beginning, but I'm not convinced we should care as much as we do, and I don't think it is that important. And so that brings us to two now questions. So if they're not that important, why did the objective and the whiteboard configuration become so important? And if those aren't important, what should be important? So the first question, why do so many teachers and administrators place such importance on having an objective on the board and a proper whiteboard configuration? And I think there's two reasons. One, in the 1980s, researchers found correlation between standardized tests and features of teachers' classrooms. A lot of these features were organizational, so they would find a correlation that said if a teacher posted an objective on the board, students seemed to do better on the standardized test. But it's important, correlation does not equal causation. So in the 80s and early 90s, we had these studies showing some basic features of teachers that when teachers used formative assessments per se, students might do better on tests. The other thing that we started to see was that research on how people learn showed learning is goal-directed. That is, when our goal is related to learning, we're going to learn more than when our goal is not related to that learning. And so here's sort of an example of the Ohio Teacher Performance Evaluation rubric, and it shows some of those instructional and assessment things that have been codified related to both the organization and the goal-directed nature. And I want to draw everyone's attention to the upper right corner. So a teacher that's accomplished is consistent and effective in communicated, differentiated learning goals, sort of expectations for mastery, and models of exemplary performance to students through multiple communication techniques. So this has now been codified, at least in Ohio, and here where I'm in Texas, we have very similar language, and I think other states have similar language as well in their teacher evaluation rubrics. And so here is an example of a standard. These are actually from Virginia for science and math. And I think it's important to realize that these standards were not written necessarily for some of the things that we might want to engage in with our instruction. So here's our standard. We know that this is the end goal of student learning, but it's not necessarily a roadmap for what should happen in the classroom. However, it's really easy to measure if a teacher is displaying the objective on the board than to ascertain if a teacher effectively communicates learning goals. So if we think about that evaluation rubric, when an administrator or another teacher comes in, it's very easy to say, oh, the objective's on the board. This teacher must be communicating learning goals. And so that sort of leads us to this situation. This is just on Pinterest. It's a screenshot of, if you type in whiteboard configuration, all the different ideas from Pinterest. So for me, in summary, posting objectives on the board does not cause student learning. Which brings us to the second question, which is what should be important to administrators and teachers, or what kinds of things should we attend to that might cause student learning? And I think the first thing is learning is goal directed. And so when we're thinking about what should we attend to based on the rubrics for teacher evaluation, as well as research on effective use of classroom space, we can ask questions like, what should the goal of learning be? And a host of reports in the STEM fields. Science for All Americans was published in, I think, 1991, up through Catalyzing Change in Middle School Mathematics, which is part of a series from NCTM that has been published in the past 5 years. And so they identified these 4 sort of broad goals: to understand the world around us, to appreciate the joy and wonder of STEM disciplines, to prepare students for future learning experiences, and to prepare students for their roles as adults in a global society. I tend to think most standards seem to be written for that third goal, preparing students for future learning experiences. So if we're talking about that math standard, that's from a middle school standard, and students will apply translations and reflections of right triangles or rectangles. And you might say, why do they need to know that? And it's because when they get to high school geometry, they're going to have to do reflections and rotations and translations for shapes that are circles or octagons, maybe. But what if we focused on this first goal, understanding the world around us? So in looking at that science standard where students need to learn about abiotic and biotic factors, and they need to learn about energy flow and food webs and relationships, what if instead of the goal is you just need to know this, it's to understand the world around us? So our goal that we communicate to students is, what is the impact on the Everglades ecosystem when an invasive species such as the Burmese python is introduced to that ecosystem? The math one, what if instead of just saying, well, you need to know translations and reflections, we asked, what set of commands do video game designers and coders use as part of games, Tetris and or Minecraft, when they need to show the movement of a shape on a screen? And it turns out that the movement of a shape on a screen is just a translation across the screen. And so when we reshape the goal of student learning, I think we can build on those studies that show putting the goal on the whiteboard or on the board can be effective. The question is it an accessible goal for students? And so I think all students should be aware of what the goal for learning is. It can be displayed for students. So I'm not saying it's bad to put the goals on the board. But there are other ways to remind students of the goal besides writing it on the board. And I think when the goal is more meaningful for students, they are more capable of keeping that goal in mind. What about the overall whiteboard configuration then? What do we think here? So I think the whiteboard can be an important tool for sharing information with students. But there are things I think we want to keep in mind. The more space we use for giving information, the less space we have for supporting student learning. And for teachers, the more time we spend on the whiteboard configuration, the less time we spend focused on learning experiences for students. So if you think back to those pictures at the beginning of this webinar, the amount of time it would take to set up some of those classroom spaces is enormous. When I was teaching, we had a first-year teacher who asked if they could paint their room. And the principal said, sure, make it inviting. But this teacher spent the entire first week back, instead of preparing learning experiences, painting their room. And not that that was bad, but did the room color, was the effort or the investment in that time worth potentially not spent on engaging and important learning experiences for students? And so when thinking about the classroom space, I think questions we want to ask is, what is the most effective and efficient way to provide important information to students? What is the best use of the whiteboard for supporting student learning? And how can we use the classroom space to keep the teacher and students organized and focused on learning? So I think part of that correlational research that was missed in the 80s and early 90s was that it wasn't that teachers who had organized rooms caused the organization caused the learning. I think it was when teachers were organized and students were organized in such a way that the focus was on learning, more learning was occurring in those classrooms. And so you can do that through a variety of simple or more elaborate approaches. So if you're a math teacher, I love this. Picking up or passing out and picking up materials in all classes is time consuming. And as a teacher, it's important to know we've got everything back. So this picture is a very simple and clear way to find out, hey, all of my calculators are back, or I'm, in this case, actually missing 5 calculators. Who still has a calculator? That takes up space on the wall or on a door, but I think that's a great way to keep a teacher organized. We also have a whole host of technology now that can keep students organized. So here's a screenshot from a Blackboard fake student. There's, to my knowledge, no real Chris Casper. I borrowed this from the wonderful folks at Blackboard. But this tells you announcements. As a teacher, I can push announcements to my students. It gives to do things, what is past due, what is due, what's new. So there are a lot of technology tools that we can use to provide important information to our students, to provide important information to our parents, and then open up the classroom space to focus more on learning and less on necessarily providing direct information for students. So the use of classroom space is an important consideration as part of teaching and learning. So I don't want to make it sound like that how we set up our classroom and what is visually accessible to students is not important. It is. But it's also important to understand why certain things are helpful. Otherwise, we risk making the design of classroom space more important than the learning that occurs within the classroom. And I think that's one of the things that has occurred with the sort of focus on posting objectives on the board and posting standards on the board and just the overall whiteboard configuration. It's that's something that's easy to observe if a teacher is or isn't doing it, and teachers that have done that in the past as part of a broader repertoire of staying organized and maintaining the focus on learning have shown increases in student learning. The problem is that too often we have made making the objective on the board the be-all, end-all of a classroom observation and less about the type of learning that's occurring in that room. And so some upcoming topics, today is why do we care if the objective is on the board. Next week, I'm going to talk about what makes instructional materials high quality. You've heard high quality instructional materials maybe as a new buzzword in education. Then on March 5th, what does good science teaching look like to an observer? Again, thinking about if a principal were to come into a science classroom, what type of things should they look for? And then on the 12th, what does the T in STEM really mean? So I think many teachers have a really good idea of what the science, engineering, and math mean, but T, the technology, has a whole host of different definitions, and that'll be at 4 o'clock to about 4:30 on Tuesdays. And if you're interested in other professional learning opportunities, you could check out ADI's offerings at our website, programs and events, or professional learning opportunities. And again, here is the information. If you want to email me with questions, please email Todd at argumentdriveninquiry.com, or you can find me on LinkedIn at Todd Hutner. And you can follow ADI on Twitter/X or Instagram or Facebook. And I believe we've actually now just launched a LinkedIn page as well. And so thank you all very much for joining me for this short talk this afternoon. And I hope to see y'all and more folks back next week.